Welcome back, and moving on to our second segment for today. And we are going first to focus on the geological and historical sites and the ancient history and civilization between Egypt and Greece. Over the phone, we have Mr. Ehab Kamel. He's a tourism expert. Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, sir. So first of all, can we talk about the interaction between ancient Egypt and early Greek civilization and its impact on both countries today?
Well, the ancient relations, or the relations between Egypt and Greece, are very ancient relations that dates back to thousands of years ago. As a matter of fact, they date back as old as the 6th century BC, during the 26th dynasty, when the Greeks had started coming to Egypt to work as mercenaries in the Egyptian army, and they started coming trading with Egypt. And we have to admit that the ancient Greeks, like Herodotus, they were the ones who introduced Egypt to the ancient world when Herodotus made his famous voyage to Egypt in the 4th century BC, describing life, describing Egypt. And that had encouraged lots of Greeks, or Greek philosophers, to come to be educated in Egypt, that from the Greek point of view was very advanced scientifically, and lots of them, they were educated in Egypt, especially in medicine, math, and different branches of science. So we can say that the relations had been there, and the bonds and ties had existed since the 6th century. It's enough to tell you that the first Greek polis in Egypt was established before Alexander the Great, before the time of Alexander the Great, by 2 centuries, when the Greek mercenaries had formed a Greek polis in Egypt that was called Naucratis in western Delta. Accordingly, we can say that these long outstanding relationships had existed maybe 2 centuries before the arrival of Alexander the Great to Egypt. Bearing in mind that also the Greeks had started to have a kind of, because of the strong relations, they started forming trading centers on the coasts, and especially in the delta. So that had allowed the Greek language to kind of spread in Egypt, and it became like a language for trade in those days.
Well, actually, when we study the concept of trade between different civilizations, actually one part of trade also is trading culture and exchanging culture. So if we talked about both countries in this respect, and how far geography helped in this?
Well, as we said before, because Greece is not far, we can say that the ancient Egyptian relations with Greece, even they go earlier than the 6th century. They go as far as the Middle Kingdom. We have records that shows strong bonds and commercial ties between Egypt and the Minoan civilization in Crete, and that was around the 20th century BC. So for the Greeks, Egypt was not a very strange country, but later on, when trade increased between Egypt and Greece, the Egyptians had started, and at that time the Greek culture was dominating the world during the 26th dynasty. I'm talking about the 6th century BC. The Greek culture became very important to the whole world, and it was really dominating the ancient world. The Egyptians had started to become affected a little bit, especially when the Greeks had founded the first Greek polis in Egypt. The polis, it's the city-state, a Greek form of ruling, where they had started to introduce new forms of political practices like democracy, like having a senate, Everyone has got the right to, as long as he pays the taxes, to show his opinion in the way the city is ruled. So these were things that the Egyptians were not aware of at that time, bearing in mind that the Greeks at that time, they were rising. Greece at that time was rising as a big superpower in the ancient world, competing with the Persian Empire. So the Egyptians, they became very much projected to the Greek culture, and a bit by bit we started to see the Greek deities appear until Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and that's where there was a major change in the amalgamation of both cultures. We started seeing new deities that has Greek and Egyptian features. We started to see new cults. We started seeing a change in the language of science, because the language of science at that time became the Greek language. And of course, after the foundation of the famous museum and the Alexandrian Library later on, that became the most important educational center in the whole world.
Well, in what way we can say that the Egyptian religion and art influence Greek thoughts and artistic expression?
As a matter of fact, there's lots of similarities, and each side was very much affected by the other. For example, you will find in the Greek mythology we have the idea of the great deity, the great god, Zeus. In ancient Egypt, we had Amun-Ra. He was the king of gods. This is a very big similarity between them both. Not only this, but you will find that some of the Egyptian deities, the Greeks had identified because they have the same features of some of their deities. Like, for example, the goddess Hathor. The Greeks, they identified it with the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and in ancient Egypt, because they found in ancient Egypt the goddess Hathor represented the same values of love, maternity, joy, and happiness. So they considered it very much like the god Aphrodite. Not only this, but also after Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt, he was not like any other conqueror. He was a man with a project. His project was mixing the Eastern culture, which from his own point of view was very much advanced scientifically, with the Western culture represented in the Greek culture, which from his perspective was very much advanced intellectually, creating a new civilization. So in Egypt, this was shown when he tried to unify between the Egyptians and the Greeks who came there, especially after the foundation of Alexandria, by inventing a new cult, which was the cult of Serapis in Alexandria. You look at Serapis, you will find that it has two forms: the form of a Greek form, looking like a man with a heavy beard, very much looking like the god Zeus, and at the same time it had an Egyptian form in the form of the bull, and it was called Osir Hapi. And not only that, but he made this god married to the Egyptian goddess, the goddess Isis, and they had a son, the god which they had called in Greek Harpocrates, driven from the Egyptian word Horus, the child. This was known as the Triad of Alexandria. And many other deities in ancient Egypt that had very common features with Greek deities. So the Greeks had started worshipping them once they got to stay in Egypt. And a bit by bit, you will find that there had been interaction between both civilizations. Lots of Greeks had started worshipping Egyptian deities. At the same time, Egyptians had started looking at the Greek deities as different forms of their own deities, and this had started reflecting on many other things like art and architecture in ancient Egypt.
Also, I think we can say that the Greek philosophy and science influenced the Egyptian society during the Hellenistic period as well.
Yes, because at that time, as I said, Greek was the dominating, or one of the dominating superpowers in the ancient world. So that had made a place like Alexandria, for example, that was the main cultural and educational center for the whole world. So every Egyptian wanted to have the best education. So lots of them were educated in Alexandria. We started seeing also the Egyptians looking at their own cult, even with a different perspective. You would find that Egyptian deities, for example, would be represented wearing Greek outfits. So there was which is showing the interaction between both civilizations.
Right, Mr. Ehab Kamel, tourism expert, thank you very much for joining us. And with this, we come to the end of our breakfast show for today. Thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned for more coming up on Nile TV International.